Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an airline pilot, and in today's video let's have a look into a real-world case of QNH blunder error which led to an airplane almost crashing into the fields just shy of Charles de Gaulle Airport in France. This case happened not so long ago, and the French Accident Investigation Bureau have just released their preliminary report not so long ago as well, which you can find linked in the video description below. However, do note that I have changed a couple parameters in order to make this demonstration a little bit, let's call it, easier to view for the general flight simmer. So what exactly happened? Basically, an incorrect QNH was transmitted for the flight crew who were about to conduct an ANAF approach into Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport. Due to the incorrect QNH transmitted to the flight crew, the approach was conducted at an altitude a lot lower than the actually published altitudes, however without the flight crew being able to notice. There were a couple of contributing factors which I am going to omit for the purpose of this video, since the purpose over here is to show you what an incorrect QNH setting can do. So, the flight was conducted on an Airbus A320 aircraft of a Maltese carrier on behalf of a carrier from Northern Europe. They initially came in at an altitude of 6,000 feet, and later the controller did give an incorrect QNH several times to the flight crew. At first they were cleared to descend to an altitude of 6,000 feet on QNH 1011, which the flight crew read back like this: 6,000 feet 1011, 1011, red nose 4311. So you could sense the pilot monitoring's confusion over here, because they did prepare having the actual HOTAS which stated a QNH of 1001 versus 1011. Later, the approach controller cleared the crew to descend to 5,000 feet, saying red nose 4311, descend 5,000 feet 1011, cleared full RMP 27 right. And the PM read back the information: descend 5,000 feet, QNH 1011, cleared full RMP approach 27 right, red nose 4311. So that is kinda where the trouble begins. So let's go ahead and follow that flight's profile. We're going to go direct to Papa Golf 650 over here, and then we are going to start our approach as well. So that's 5,000 feet. Let's go down vertical speed. So a little bit later, the intermediate approach controller instructed an EasyJet flight crew to descend 5,000 with the same incorrect QNH, saying Easy 75 Mike Alpha, direct Papa Golf 650, and descend 5,000 feet 1011, cleared RMP approach 27 right. The EasyJet crew read back given the valid QNH, namely 1001, without asking for confirmation of the QNH value. This was not noticed by the controller. A little bit later, an Air France flight crew in French was instructed to descend to 5,000 as well, with the correct QNH of 1001. However, it is my assumption that since this clearance was given in French, that the Maltese crew was not able to understand the different QNH, and did probably not notice it when the EasyJet read it back, because they simply read back the correct QNH of 1001, while the approach controller also said 1011. So let's take a short moment here to discuss why this is actually that much of a problem. So let's start with the fact that the crew have been flying an ANAF approach compared to an ILS approach. So when you fly an ANAF approach in pretty much any aircraft, then your vertical profile is going to be computed by the flight management system. So the flight management system is using the QNH that on one hand side has been entered on the approach phase, but it is primarily using what you have entered in the EFIS control panel. So if an incorrect QNH is given to the pilot over there, then you will basically have no means of noticing the incorrect flight path other than by comparing the radio altimeter indications to the altimeter indications. However, it is worth noting at this point that radio altimeter indications must not necessarily give you a correct value because, well, they are radio altitude, so they are height above the ground where you currently are, not height above the ground of the airport. So you will not have a, let's call it, correct radio altimeter indication for your height above the airport when you're flying, for example, above hilly terrain. And in real life there is always a little bit of a slope in the terrain, so it is quite easy to overlook this on the radio altimeter. There are some SOPs in place these days on Airbus operators. On Boeing's, as I mentioned, the vertical situation display provides some great input for an approach like this. On Airbuses, however, the current mitigation measures include pre-selecting the QNH in cruise flight and then questioning what you get when you are actually on approach. So if you pre-selected the correct one in this case, let's say 1001, and then the controller tells you 1011, you will notice that when setting the QNH you need to reselect it. So that is going to somewhat give you a hint. Then you can compare the QNH value from ATC with that from the HOTAS, and finally, if you're flying a non-precision approach, it may be a good idea to have the tower controller confirm the QNH on your approach. It is worth noting at this point as well that the crew did not get any GPWS alerts because the eGPWS is built in a way that there is a certain approach slope in the system where basically the system is not going to give you any warnings to allow you to descend slightly below the path without mandating a go-around. This is called the eGPWS Terrain Clearance Floor Envelope. Alright, for the purpose of this video and to show you exactly what's been going on the flight in question, let's go ahead and select the standby altimeter to the correct QNH of 1001 so that you have a chance to see how big the error is. Also, we're just intercepting final approach over here. Let's go flaps 2 and set the missed approach altitude of 5,000 feet. And now we can have a look into the approach and the dangers associated with it. So looking into the approach chart, currently sponsored by Navigraph, thank you very much for that. We've got the distance to altitude tables over here, and in the interviews after the incident, the crew have confirmed that they did the distance to altitude checks. However, with an incorrect QNH dialed in, you are going to get correct results in terms of what is indicated without the ability to notice your deviation from the flight path. So if we look into this, we are now 12 miles from the runway. We're showing 4,300 feet. Looking at the chart, 12 miles, 4,270 feet. So we are showing on profile over here. Now, for those of you who are not aware, the difference in altitude readout is approximately 27 feet per hectopascal. So with a QNH of 1011 dialed in compared to 1001 being the actual QNH, we are flying approximately 270 feet too low compared to what the correct flight profile would be. You can nicely see this on the standby altimeter right now, where I dialed in the correct QNH, just to give you a little bit of an indication there. Now this flight actually proceeded all the way down to the minimums, and note at this point that they did use LNAV VNAV minimums because the operator was not certified for LPV operation, and it was operator policy at the time to add 50 feet to the published charted minima. So we've got a cut Charlie airplane, and the published minima is 752, and the crew added 50 feet to that, so they approached with a QNH of, with a minimum of 802 feet, which you can see I've dialed in up here. The crew did state that they did not note any radio altimeter callouts except for the 2,500 and the 1,000 foot calls, so basically they said that they did not catch any of the radio altimeter callouts, which might have given a hint in the end of the flight. So we just received the 2,500 call, and to show you how you can pick up an error like this, we show 2,400 here, 3,000 over here. That means that we have a difference of 600 feet between the primary barometric and the radio altimeter. Now 600 feet of a difference should be your airport elevation. However, if you look at this, you can see that the airport is located at 390 feet. So that is a line of defense, how you can pick up an error like this. In the real world, when the approach has been flown, the weather was a little bit better than what I have set in my simulator over here. The real-life HOTAS stated at the point that the weather conditions were 280 at 10 knots, visibility 10 kilometers, broken clouds at 1,500 feet, few cumulonimbus at 5,000, temperature 19, QNH 1001. So you can see I've made the weather a little bit worse in my simulator over here, just to give you a little bit of a better idea of how easily this might fool you into flying straight into the terrain. Right, so let's bring the plane into landing configuration. We keep following the published VNAV path. Landing checklist, ECA memo, landing no blue, landing checklist complete. So, what is important over here now? We're at 4.8 miles, that means we should be at an altitude of 1,970, and you can see that we are at 1,970 on our barometric altitude. But if you check the standby, which I've dialed into the correct QNH, you can see that we're only at 1,600 and a bit, so that is about the difference that we have. Again, the radio altimeter versus the barometric altimeter does give it away to a certain extent, however that is only valid if you're approaching over flat terrain, and terrain is always a little bit hilly. We got the 1000 call now. We look at the barometric altimeter, we see 1600. That is an indication that something is wrong. But apart from that, if we do the distance versus altitude checks, we can see 3 miles from the runway. We should be in 1400, and you can see our primary altimeter does show us at 1400. So again, the airplane is going to fly you in simply too low based on the incorrect QNH value. Now, the real flight initiated the go-around exactly at the published minima, because they were unable to see the runway. However, you will see in a few moments how low they actually got. So look at that, we're getting out of the clouds, and we're flying straight into the terrain. Due to a very strong shower passing ahead of the airport, the crew did actually not see the runway at that point. So when the missed approach was conducted, they got down to 6 feet radio altitude. Okay, that should not happen. You should not get the GPWS warning. They did not get it due to the terrain clearance flaw in the real world. Okay, approaching minimum. Let's initiate the go-around now. And you can see where we ended up down here. So, go-around flaps. The real one descended even a little bit lower, going all the way down to an altitude of 6 feet radio. Okay, positive climb, gear up. In real life, when they noticed their low altitude, the captain disconnected the autopilot and went in all the way to manual flight to manually pull the airplane up. As mentioned, descending down to 6 feet over the ground. Okay. So, as per real life, they got instructed to fly a right-hand turn heading 360, and then they got vectored in for a second approach. Now, we are going to fly the second approach just like the real crew did, and I'm going to show you how this turned out in the end and how this went into a proper landing. The most important point that I want you to take away from this is that this thing can happen to, well, basically anyone, but there are some safeguards in place, and as we're about to turn downwind for our second approach, I'm going to show you which safeguards these are. So, as I mentioned, when it actually happened, the GPWS should not have triggered, so it looks like Phoenix did not simulate the GPWS terrain clearance flaw correctly here. If you have a look into the actual BEA report, and I can show you that in a few moments, the terrain clearance flaw of the Airbus does actually make sure that you do not get a warning in a case like this, because, as I mentioned, it does allow for a little bit of a deviation. So, for our second approach coming in, I am going to make the weather a little bit better. So let's go ahead and take that cloud layer, move it up a little bit so that we get an earlier view down on the runway. and then we can go ahead with our second approach. FMS preparation, we are going to activate the approach phase, direct 2. Okay, Papa Golf 650, radial in, and insert that. Okay, very quick check. Here the approach is again, very good. Okay, so you can see how we've got much too low, much too early. Now, when you are thinking about an approach like this, it is very easy for the general flight simmer to think that, yeah, well, it's just 300 feet on my altimeter, what can possibly happen? Well, take a moment to think about what 300 feet on your altimeter actually mean. Basically, 300 feet means as much as 1 nautical mile that you're going to arrive too early on the ground. Remember, we are flying 3-degree profiles on the vast majority of our approaches, and on those 3-degree profiles we basically lose 1 nautical mile per 300 feet, or to put it in different words, we basically lose we basically cover 3 nautical miles per 1,000 feet altitude. So you can see how that little difference of 10 hectopascal incorrect QNH here can easily lead to a problem like this. So after the crew went around, they got vectors back to downwind for a second approach, but at no time during the second approach was the QNH confirmed by air traffic control. What did, however, happen just about at the time where the crew reached the minimum is that the air traffic controllers got minimum safe altitude warning in the tower, and they asked the crew if everything was alright and if the runway was in sight. Now, the crew never recalled hearing that call because they were probably busy with flying the airplane at that point, so we can't blame the crew at all for that. However, it was recorded, so the controller actually did it. So when that happened, the controller got replaced by the backup controller. That is a standard procedure when you encounter, let's call it, a very stressful situation like that, where you almost lost an airplane. So they replaced the controller with a backup controller. However, on the second approach, the very same thing happened again, but luckily the weather was a little bit better at that time because the shower had moved through, and therefore the crew were able to see the runway a little bit earlier. So before we are going to shoot the second approach, I want to show you a couple of images from the real-life incident reports, which we referenced for this video. So if we have a look into the report over here and go down to a graphic like this, over here we get some very interesting information on what actually happened. So this is the analysis of the real-life investigation. You can see down here the terrain model, and you can see over here the decision altitude, and up here we've got the actual flight path of the airplane, and above that we've got the flight path that was indicated in blue, and we've got the published descent profile in the dashed line. So as you can see, the crew went down through the actual minimum, but they showed still to be above it. And then when the go-around was initiated, shortly after the indicated minimum has been reached, you can see the airplane continue to descend for a little bit before it started climbing. And if we have a look at the indications down here, we can see how low they actually got. So the controller received the MSOR warning just a tiny bit before the crew actually initiated the go-around. And as you can see, at decision altitude and the MSOR message from the operating air traffic controller, the captain applied the pitch up input and then applied toga at pretty much the lowest point of the descent, and then they conducted the missed approach. However, still notice over here that the crew read back the QNH 1011 when they were cleared for the climb, so you can see that they conducted the second approach as well at the lower altitudes. So before we continue with the next graphics, let's quickly go direct to waypoint 650 once again and conduct our second approach. where I'm going to show you what happened before the crew then finally safely landed the airplane. Okay, so going over to the next graphic, we've got a visual representation of what's been happening that includes the times at which it happened as well. So over here you can see how quickly everything went. At 11:41 and 32 seconds, the radio altitude was 200 feet and the MSOR warning appeared for the first time in the control tower. Now, when that happened, the airplane or the controller initially didn't advise the crew yet. He took a little bit longer, which is actually quite expected, because it needs a little bit of time for the human being to actually analyze what's been going on and then act on it, which is totally normal. But as you can see, we're at 32 seconds over here, and then going up to the next point just 9 seconds later, the radio altimeter showed 122 feet. The decision altitude was reached on the primary flight display based on the incorrect QNH, and the MSOR message from ATC was given as well, saying, Red Nose 4311, I just had a ground proximity alert. Are you okay? Do you see the runway? The flight crew, however, did not react to that, but as you can see, just 6 seconds later, at 47 seconds, radio altitude now being 52 feet, the captain applied pitch up inputs, and then just 3 seconds later, the radio altitude now being 6 feet, toga was applied, and they initiated the go-around. Alright, so we talked about a couple of lines of defense that we can take for something like this to happen already, but let's just go ahead and repeat the most important points for you. So, first of all, in cruise flight, if you are flying an airplane that has the capability of pre-selecting the QNH, and that is the case on pretty much any modern EFIS equipped aircraft except for the Boeing 757-767, which only has analog altimeters like the one you can see over here. So obviously over here you can't pre-select the QNH. However, if you are flying anything like an A320, in cruise flight, when you are still on standard QNH, just go to local for a second, pre-select the QNH from the HOTAS and then go back to standard and continue your flight. The Airbus is smart enough that when you do a procedure like this in cruise, it is not going to start climbing or descending, but indeed it is simply going to maintain the flight level that it was previously maintaining. So the airplane is smart enough to notice that you are pre-selecting the QNH, and it is not going to initiate a climb or descent based on that. When you then get your QNH from air traffic control on the approach, you are going to just select the local QNH, so you simply push the knob in. And if you then have a difference between what ATC told you and what is indicated, you should establish the reason for that difference, and in many cases that reason is actually going to be, well, an error. Now, the QNH can change, and changes of 1 or in significant cases 2 hectopascals between the time where you've been conducting your approach preparation and between the actual approach being conducted are totally normal. So that can happen, and that is totally normal, but a change of 10 hectopascals in a time like this is physically almost impossible if you don't have a major storm cell going through, and in that case you probably don't want to approach anyway. So the important thing to take away over here, pre-select your QNH in the cruise, and then when you conduct your approach, also cross-check the QNH given from air traffic control with what you entered in the approach page, and cross-check it with the HOTAS that you received earlier on. If you're flying Flight Simulator, you probably don't have an HOTAS available if you don't fly online, so at least go ahead and check it against the QNH given by the META that you probably requested earlier during the flight. Apart from that, it is a good idea to have a look into the general approach area. Just get yourself familiar. Are there any mountains that we're flying over? Are there any obstacles or anything, so that you can get a rough idea to compare the radio altitude that you get with your indicated altitude. It does help, however, that is not 100% mitigation, because as I mentioned earlier, when you are approaching over hilly terrain, and let's be totally honest, except for the Netherlands, which terrain in the world is entirely flat? So You will always have some minor differences there, so it can give you an idea, however, it must not necessarily do that. Now, in the A320neo, Airbus have actually implemented a system that cross-checks the accuracy of the QNH and the indicated altitude against the GPS altitude. So Airbus did recognize the problem with QNH blunder error as well, and they did try to do something about it. However, at this point in time, only the Neo aircraft are equipped with that, and most airlines have not retrofitted their older A320ceo aircraft. So that's something to keep in mind over here. If you're flying a Neo, then the airplane might have a mitigation and can warn you about incorrect QNH settings. If you're flying a conventional engine option, then that is probably not being the case. Now, if you're flying an airplane that has a vertical situation display installed, at least on Boeing aircraft, I'm not 100% sure about Airbus aircraft here, to be honest, because the versions I fly don't have a VSD. Basically, only the A380 and the A350 have one. So if you're flying Boeing with a VSD installed, always have a look at the runway symbol as well to make sure that it lies above the terrain. Alright then, we're established on the final approach, landing checklist, ECA memo, landing no blue, landing checklist complete. And you can see we're still flying on the incorrect QNH, just like the real flight crew did. Now, I do hope that the weather scenario here in Microsoft Flight Simulator is going to do what I wanted to do. You saw me raising the clouds a little bit earlier, so I do hope that we're eventually going to pop out of the clouds and out of the rain, so that we can correct our approach before we actually reach the minimum, because that is what the real crew eventually did. So the real crew on the second approach they flew came out of the clouds a little bit earlier, were able to see the runway, and then disconnected the automatics and continued the approach manually. Right, looks like the sim decided to put a shower just over the airport once again, so let me quickly change the weather over here. So now we've got the low terrain inside, and we can go ahead, disconnect the automatics. The crew stated in the real world that when they actually reached the VMC, so when they left the clouds, they saw the puppies and they saw what they called one white, one pink, and two red. So basically they somewhat saw the puppies. They were still within the stabilized approach criteria, and therefore they corrected the path manually, as we just did, and continued for a safe landing on the second approach. Alright, so that is going to be it for this video. I do hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, then do let me know in the comments below. I'm looking forward to your comments, and finally would like to thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, then do leave a like, as it does help with the YouTube algorithms, and do comment to let me know what you think about an incident like this, and what other possible measures for an incorrect QNH correction you may be aware of. Thank you very much for watching. I see you all again on the next one, and if this turns out to be a smooth landing, I would love to see you as a channel member, or maybe make a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Smooth but long. Smooth but long. Okay, spoilers, reverse green diesel. $70 knots. Manual brakes. Thank you very much for watching, everyone, and I see you all again on the next one.